Okay, this is a buzzer beater because my battery is about to die. Hi friends, update. So in June 2020, I recorded a video and I posted a cut of it on Patreon, but before I could finish it and post it on YouTube, I lost it. I either deleted or misplaced files. You know, the kind of files that if you delete, it's actually so bad that like you might as well just throw everything out and start over again. But then of course I did not have the energy or spell slots with which to do that. So I kind of just didn't go back to. It was like, it will never be, the world will never see my hottest of takes about this particular subject. But, haha! I found the files. So I was able to restore them, and then when I opened up the Premiere file, it was there. It could work again. I edited it, I added some music, and here it is. Better late than never. More than a year after the fact, for your enjoyment, without any further ado, Oyster Pirates Part 2, The Oyster Wars. I bet you thought I'd never actually get back to talking about oyster pirates. Shows you. Now, many of the same catalysts that created the San Francisco oyster pirates also led to the Oyster War on the East Coast. Things like economic need, capitalism, and the world's voracious appetite for this particular bivalve, etc., etc., etc. But there are some fundamental differences between the oyster piracy that happened on the West Coast and what happened on the East Coast. For one, the sheer amount of time it occurred. Now, the Oyster War, up there with the Whiskey Rebellion and the Molasses Flood for food-related historical events, really more like Oyster Wars, since these were really just a series of confrontations instead of one long drawn-out, spans from 1865 to 1959. Yeah, we could have been calling it the 100 Years Oyster War. We missed it by that much. Okay, first, let's talk about oysters on the East Coast. Oysters grow faster in warmer water, so they're gonna grow bigger, faster in places like the Chesapeake Bay than, say, Cape Cod. And in American history on the whole, bigger, blander oysters were preferred, which, why would you ever want a larger, blander oyster? This just makes no sense to me. I'm looking at you, Diamond Jim Brady. You had all that money and you blew it on bland oysters because they were the biggest you could get at Delmonico's. Everyone knows it's not the size of the boat, but the motion of the ocean. You Gilded Age bastard. You can take small, briny oysters from my cold, dead hands! Sorry, it's just been a long time since I've been able to enjoy an oyster. Up until the early 19th century, oystermen up and down the East Coast used tongs to collect oysters. Usually, these would be crews of 2 to 3 people on a small, flat boat. You would allow the heavy irons at the bottom of the tongs to slip down into the water until the handles stood up vertically. Then, you would spread the handles apart, opening the teeth. You'd open and close the tongs several times until you felt you had a good batch of oysters. Then slowly raise the tongs and dump the catch on the culling board. The culler would then break up the clusters of oysters and toss the ones too small back overboard. This was generally pretty sustainable. Tonging stirred up the bed, exposed new surfaces, and promoted new attachments and a fresh crop. And then New England ruined everything. I'm kidding! Only a little bit. It's okay. I still love you, New England. Bless your heart. In 1809, New England oystermen began dredging for oysters, and the practice soon spread to states like New York and Connecticut. Now, dredging, in theory, giant caveats though, big caveats, huge tracts of caveats, can be used responsibly. So how much do you want to bet that in the 19th century, it was used responsibly? Yeah, that's what I thought. A dredge is a scoop-like instrument pulled by rope or cable across the bottom of the ocean by a ship. It does not discriminate in what it grabs. And because it tends to be fortified by chain and would later be used by steam-powered ships and not just sail-powered ones, they were super effective. Yeah, super effective at destroying the reefs and beds that oysters and other sea life depended on. Now, dredges left few oysters for reproduction, and the beds of Long Island and Cape Cod were quickly exhausted, requiring the import of seed oysters. Now, Maryland, in a shocking move of intelligence, banned dredging in 1820, but then legalized it again in 1865. However, with caveats. For one, dredgers could only dredge in deep water, while the shallow waters were reserved for people who relied on tonging. Now, that seems pretty reasonable, right? New England dredge boats soon entered Chesapeake Bay, and their reports of abundant seafood brought on a great oyster rush. Marylanders protested against the plundering Yankee dredgers and passed a law banning oystering by non-residents. Guess how effective that law was? Go on. I'll wait. Yep. Despite the law prohibiting out-of-state dredgers, many outsiders registered their vessels under Maryland owners with false bills of sale. Through bribery, forged licenses, and co-partnerships with Maryland residents, Yankees like H.C. Rao evaded the state residency requirement and controlled an oyster fleet of nearly 100 sailing vessels and 700 seamen. When his own men could not provide him with oysters, Rao bought them from pirates and renegades. And that was just one guy. One guy. Those Yankees just ran on down to Maryland to get it on the sweet, sweet oyster deal after the Civil War. Like a bunch of New Yorkers that register their cars in Florida so they don't have to pay New York tax. Or people who shop in Delaware so they don't have to pay sales tax. I see you. But Yankees weren't Maryland's only problem. Virginia did not restrict dredging, and also did not enforce the federal law requiring its watermen to remain on its own territorial waters. So many Virginia oystermen poached oysters in Maryland. Et tu, Virginia? 1. There was a kind of common belief among oystermen that you couldn't own an oyster bed, that it was free for the taking, common land. How very dare a state like Maryland try to lease an acre of oyster bed or lease the rights to how many oysters you could collect? Who do they think they are, a state government or something? These are my rights. You know, I really wasn't expecting this episode to be so topical. 2. Even though the Civil War disrupted the Chesapeake Bay economy, causing many Maryland watermen to turn to smuggling over oystering because it was more profitable, according to the book The Oyster Wars of Chesapeake Bay, after the Civil War, 2 developments spurred an unprecedented expansion of the oyster industry. The development of a reliable steam canning process that allowed for long-distance transport of oysters and a booming post-war economy that gave people additional money to purchase status-conferring comforts and delicacies. Which leads us to 3. Oyster Mania! After the Civil War, many cities, including those out west and in Europe, really enjoyed eating oysters. In New York City alone, according to the book The Big Oyster, it was usual for a family to have 2 oyster dinners a week. It was one of the few moments in culinary history when a single food, served in more or less the same preparations, was commonplace for all socioeconomic levels. 4. Oysters, though popular, were dirt cheap. And when things are cheap, you make more money the more you harvest. That's just economics. 5. Dredging was depleting natural beds up and down the East Coast, and that was putting dredgers and tongers at odds. Dredgers were constantly looking for new beds to plunder, and tongers suffered for it. Going back to Maryland's original decision that dredgers could have the deep water rights while tongers could stay in the shallows, if you're a dredger, you can exploit both areas easily, but a tonger can only rely on what their tongs can reach. Not only were the oyster pirates dredging in shallow water, they weren't culling or tossing back oysters that were 3 inches or smaller. This further damaged the reproductive health of the oyster population. Some oystermen fought against dredging, recognizing early on that dredging destroyed the reefs that oysters anchored to in deeper water. Some dredgers followed the law, keeping to the deep waters they were allowed to. It became pretty clear, pretty quickly, however, that oystermen that followed the law ended up screwed. Oystermen that broke the law made the most profit. 6. Life along the waterfront was hard and often violent. By 1868, the Oyster Navy was formed to fight oyster piracy and to protect the interest of tongers from dredgers plundering shallow oyster beds at night. However, at first, the Maryland Oyster Navy was completely hamstrung at being effective at their job. There was just too much ground to cover, and they had no money in which to do it. Thanks, local government. That forced many tongers to take the law into their own hands. Tongers would confront oyster pirates, often shooting at them from the shore. Hardly a week went by without a violent death on the water. A Baltimore Sun reporter noted that something new was floating in the Chester and Choptank rivers: the bloated bodies of dead oystermen. During the 1880s, the oyster boom on the Chesapeake was at its height. In 1884, the peak year for the industry, watermen harvested a record 15 million bushels of oysters. And the 1880s was the greatest period of conflict during the Oyster Wars. Now, there are various tales, like Captain Wilson, an African-American oysterman who led both African-American and white tongers to build fortification against the dredgers, and who captured the oyster dredger Florence and burned her to the waterline. Captain Wilson and his band of oystermen would also place a cannon on land to bombard the pirate vessels when they invaded. Or the story of Gus Rice, an oyster pirate particularly infamous for his no-holds-barred violence, and who drew unwanted attention to himself by accidentally mistaking an innocent boat full of women and children for an oyster navy boat, and then fired upon it. Good news. I'm pretty sure no women and children were hurt. But it was a really bad move for Gus, and he should have felt bad. But my favorite story has to do with Virginia Governor William Evelyn Cameron. Please don't get it twisted. I do not consider Cameron the good guy in this story. Okay, so he served in the Confederate Army and was injured at Manassas, and then during the Reconstruction period, which was so much more complex than anyone taught me in high school, thanks for that, he went from being pro-secessionist to being a post-war Republican, and then went back to being a conservative Democrat. Just pick a side, man! As governor, Cameron was a member of the Readjuster Party, which aspired to break the power of wealth and establish privilege among the planter elite of white men in the state, and also to promote public education. During Reconstruction, this party had pretty biracial support. So you have this guy, who wants to prove how rad his party is at the time and how hard they fight for the common people. So it wasn't enough for Cameron that Virginia finally had its own oyster pirate fighting force. Little late to the party, but welcome anyway. No, he had to go fight pirates personally. Could you be more Virginian, Cameron? I mean, it's a bit much. This was the first official Oyster War in 1882. Cameron gathered a group of volunteers and set sail on the Victoria J. Peed. They then bottlenecked and captured 59 dredgers in the Rappahannock River. It was a rousing success for Cameron. Great for optics. Awesome popularity boost. 10-10 would do again. Which he did it again in 1883 for the Second Oyster War. And just like so many sequels, it was not as good as the first one for him. Due to things like poor weather and bad luck and, that the oyster pirates got an advanced warning about the raid, it was embarrassing. Ships accidentally ran aground, oyster pirates escaped into Maryland. The governor had invited some newspaper men along to write about the events, and they took great pleasure in documenting the 3 women oyster pirates aboard a sloop called the Dancing Molly, who skillfully escaped Cameron's forces. According to the Norfolk Virginian, spectators along the Virginia shore really wished for the safety of the tiny craft after they realized it was crewed by 3 women. And when the Dancing Molly got safely out, the group of Virginians gave 3 cheers for the pirate's wife and daughters. It was particularly humiliating for the governor. So no, Cameron couldn't single-handedly stop oyster piracy in Virginia's waters. But then he remembered, oh wait, I'm the freaking governor of Virginia. In February 1884, he informed lawmakers that the state's losses from oyster piracy totaled a minimum of $2 million per year, After realizing that real damage was being done to the state's economy, Virginia lawmakers enacted a bill that established the Board on the Chesapeake and its tributaries. This agency was authorized to purchase, arm, and staff a permanent naval police force to protect the Commonwealth's oyster interests. Virginia's legislature was like, I can excuse the murder of oyster tongers, but I draw the line at economic losses. The fury of the Oyster Wars would ebb and flow as the years went on. Escalation ensued depending on public opinion. The Oyster Navy would be outfitted by howitzers and cannons and would often ram the pirate dredgers. Sail power was overtaken by steam engines and then diesel, and all while the oyster beds, the Potomac and the Chesapeake Bay, were rapidly exhausted. There was a lull in the demand for oysters starting in World War I and leading into the Great Depression, and the Oyster Navy would be enlisted to fight bootleggers during Prohibition. A mini-oyster boom in the 1940s and 50s, however, would see a large number of oystermen return to the Chesapeake Bay to follow the money, and conflict would again resume. In 1959, an oyster pirate named Berkeley Muse was shot and killed, which led to the disbandment of the Oyster Navy. At that point, public opinion felt it was just a step too far to kill a man just for trying to take some oysters. Really, the story of the Oyster War is one of the golden goose, of the economic greed of people rich enough not to care, and the economic desperation of people who would have cared, but just couldn't afford to play by the rules. With the dangers and hardships of oystering, and a society that offered no safety net, could the oystermen of the Chesapeake, of New England, of New York really afford the long game of conservation? With life too short, and the money too good, and the risk just far enough away on that horizon, short-term security was usually picked over long-term survival. What can I say? Like most good pirate stories, this one kind of ends a real bummer. Drink up, me hearties, yo-ho.
Thank you as ever to my ear lenders, Allison J., Avi Finkel, Catherine Escobar, Chandra, Jason Lucas, Johan Gustafson, John Smith, Spectral Ghost, Steve Harper, William Christopher, and Xanthan Pink. I have no postcards for this episode, so if you would like to keep this travesty from ever happening again, please send me a postcard, and details for the P.O. Box are in the comments below. If you like this episode, be sure to like, subscribe. On that note, see you next time.